I welcome you all to the module 7. Module 7 is about emotion, and this is the second lecture of this module, and overall this is the lecture number 18. So, today's lecture is titled as Historical Background and Theories Related to Emotions. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture. So, in the last lecture, which was lecture number 17, we discussed the basic definition of emotions and what are the components of emotion when we try to define it. We also discussed the difference between the concept of affect, emotions and moods, how these terms are different from each other when we use in a specific context. Then we discussed how do we classify emotions. So, there are two broad approaches that we talked about. One is the concept of basic emotional model, the model that tries to classify the basic emotions which are universal and fundamental experiences across cultures, and they have very specific physiological correlates and so on. Then we also discussed the dimensional model of emotions, which talks about emotion based on the balance, that is pleasantness, unpleasantness, and and what is the level of arousal they have in terms of activation and deactivation. So, we discussed this circumplex model, and at the end we discussed communication of emotions. How do we communicate emotions, especially through the non-verbal mode and through the facial expression. So, these are the things that we discussed in the last lecture. In today's lecture, we will talk about some of the historical background and theories that looks at emotions and how they explain emotions. So, in that context, we will talk about Charles Darwin, William James, and some of the theories related to emotions. So, let us start today's lecture. So, let us try to understand how emotion has been conceptualized and understood from the historical perspective. So, emotion has been core themes of writing in the philosophers, writers, literature and so on, because emotion is at the center of human experience. We cannot imagine human life without emotions. So, this has always been part of the diverse writings across literature, philosophies and so on. Early in the 19th century, the psychologists' understandings of emotion was formed in contrast to what eventually in place of prevailing theological notions of emotion as passions and affections of the souls. So, theologists in the various religious perspectives also emotion has also been explained in detail and the various concepts associated with it. In the early 19th century, psychology started looking into emotions, and that is where, and then it evolved understanding of emotion evolved from then. So, psychology's initial focus on emotion was on the nature of consciousness, physiological sensations and brain function. So, initially psychologists looked at emotions from the perspective of how the nature of consciousness is connected to the emotion, then what are the physiological sensations and indicators, brain functions, how it is associated with emotions and so on. So, lot of these physiological and consciousness perspectives, the themes were very dominant in the initial phases of understanding of emotion in the field of psychology. If you look at the modern understanding of emotions, it can be credited to a lot of work of the Charles Darwin, William James, Wilhelm Wundt, Sigmund Freud and many others that we will talk about. So, with the work of a lot of these psychologists and other disciplines, people like Charles Darwin and others, they have started the base of scientific understanding of emotions. So, we will talk about some of those specific historical conceptualizations and theories that shaped the understanding of emotion in today's contemporary psychology. So, let us try to understand what is the contribution of Charles Darwin in understanding emotions. Charles Darwin was one of the first people who actually talked about emotions from the evolutionary perspective. He published one of the most significant book on emotion. The name of that book is The Expression of the Emotion in Man and Animals. So, he talked about emotions and compared it with the animals and humans. So, that is one of the classic books when we talk about earlier understanding of emotion. In that book, Darwin pointed out some of the important aspects of emotion. For example, emotional expressions evolved. So, according to Darwin, why we express emotions, so diverse emotions. One of the things is there is an evolutionary reasons behind it. So, it either directly from adapted behavior or through association with the adapted behavior, because emotional expression help us to adapt to circumstances and situations, and that is how a species grew. And so, lot of this emotion evolved either as an expression of adaptation or whatever was associated with the adaptation. So, they become associated with the adapted behavior. Emotional expressions are external representation of the internal state and plays vital role in communication. He also said the role of emotion in communication. He said it is through emotion we communicate, and emotions are always a reflection of our inner state through expression. He also said the existence of basic primary emotions which are universally represented in the body posture. He also talked about some of the basic emotions which are universally represented, and they are always expressed through the body postures, including face and so on. So, some of these understandings were very classic understanding, and a lot of these are still accepted in the today's research based understanding. Charles Darwin in his book tried to address some of the major questions that are still guiding research in emotion. For example, he also discussed how are emotions expressed in humans and animals, how they express it. So, he elaborately expanded on this idea. He said Darwin proposed various emotional expression using body and facial muscles. He elaborately explained how through the body posture, facial expression, animals and humans express emotions in the context of humans across different cultures and so on. So, he gave rich understanding about the expression of emotions. He also addressed the question, where do our emotions come from? What is the source of emotion? From where emotions comes? So, Darwin also addressed that issue. He said, he argued that emotional expression originated from the behaviors that were once adaptive. So, he linked emotions with the adaptive behavior, because through expression of emotion it helps us to survive as a species. So, emotional expression are connected to that adaptive behavior, because there is an advantage to such emotional expression. So, therefore, it evolved. So, that is what it evolved out of those adaptive behavior, So, because it was associated with the adaptive behavior. So, emotional expression originated from such adaptive behaviors. It either from our evolutionary past helping ancestor to survive, emotional expression, or our individual past learned through personal experiences. So, emotional expressions originate from behavior, either from the evolutionary past or our individual past. So, it can come from both the sources. Over time, even when the original function is no longer needed, the expression remains as habit. So, because we develop a lot of emotional expression as an evolutionary adaptive function, even though later when a lot of these situations never arise in our life, we still show those emotions because they were once connected with the adaptive behavior, but no longer they no longer serve any specific purpose, but still remain as a habit. So, consistent with the theory of evolution, Darwin said animal emotions are evolutionary antecedent of human expression. So, our emotional expression evolved from is an antecedent of animal expression. So, animal also express emotions. Our expression is also came from those animal antecedents. For example, how emotions serve as an evolutionary advantage. What Darwin said. Let us give some specific example. For example, some expression develop because they help us to survive and communicate. Every emotion communicates something. Okay? So, they help us to survive. For example, if you look at anger as an emotion, what it shows? Animals or humans express anger showing teeth, tightening muscles, which originally help in fighting or threatening enemies, if you see at the species level, at the evolutionary level. So, such kind of behavior by tightening muscles, showing teeth, help other enemies, help them to frighten their animals and help them to survive. So, anger served as a survival process. So, if you look at from the evolutionary perspective. Other emotions such as fear, widened eyes, raised eyebrows when we express fear, it also helps ancestors to see better and detect danger quickly, and if necessary they can run away and save their life. So, emotion help to survive. So, emotions like anger, fear, these are very important, they are very important in our survival process. and they help us to survive. Okay. So, even today we show the expressions automatically even when they are not directly needed for survival. Still, when we are angry, we show these teeth tightening muscles and so on. We no longer may need directly to frighten someone, but still we show it as an habit because this was associated once with the survival process. So, these are some of the examples that lot of this expression still may not have any specific function in today's context, but we still show them as a habit because they were once associated with, those expressions were associated with survival process. Second is, let us say, how at the individual level how this habit forms emotional expression. Some expressions develop through personal experience and repetition. For example, a child who cries when hurt learns that it brings attention. So, child learns, whenever the child learns, the parents and the mother gives immediate attention, there may be some problem. So, child learns that whenever the child cries, he or she will get attention. Okay. Over time, crying becomes a habitual emotional response. Okay. So, to get attention, the child may cry and it may become a habit process of a child, So, this behavior may even continue when the original need is reduced or there is no longer needed, So, still one child can cry whenever there may not be any specific dangers or need for attention and so on, just because of the habit formation and so on. So, like this, lot of these emotions has an evolutionary significance and we learn it even from our personal habit formation in our life. So, the Darwin has contributed a lot in the understanding our emotion, and still lot of understanding of Darwin's concept are still guiding modern research also. Now, let us look at the William James, how he contributed to the understanding of emotions, and he also proposed a specific theory associated with emotions. So, William James says bodily changes follow directly the perceptions of the exciting fact, and feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. So, let us understand what is the meaning of this statement, how he defined emotions. Now, William James claimed that physiological changes precede emotional experiences. What does that mean? Physiological changes precede emotional experiences. So, that means first physiological changes happens whenever there is a situation, you face a situation, there is a physiological changes and then emotional experiences arises. So, this is a little bit counterintuitive. We generally think we experience emotion, then physiological changes happens like heartbeat increases and so on. But James says it is opposite, that first when you see any emotional situation, so there is a changes in the body and then you say I am experiencing emotions. So, this proposition violates common sense belief that physiological changes are consequences of an emotional experiences. Generally, we believe we experience emotion, as a result of that experience certain bodily changes happens. William James is saying the other way around. When we experience something in the environment, physiological changes happens first and then we interpret those changes as an emotional experiences. So, what he is saying, we generally think that I am afraid, therefore, I am trembling. This is our common sense belief. So, if somebody is trembling, one will always say because I am afraid. So, there is an emotion of fear. Because of fear, I am trembling. The William James will say the other way around. James theory will say, I am trembling, therefore, I am afraid. So, you first see what is happening in your body. So, you see your body is trembling, you say then I must be afraid. So, here physiological reaction happens first and then we label them as an emotion. So, we label physiological emotion, physiological changes in the body, and we define certain emotions based on the situation and so on. So, according to this theory, emotions are the level we give to the way the body reacts to certain situation. So, we encounter situations, then certain bodily changes happens and then we give some level to that as an emotion. Another psychologist, Carl Lange, proposed a similar idea at the same time, and therefore, this theory is named as James Lange theory. He also proposed similar idea. So, it got combined and it became James Lange theory. So, this is just a visual representation of this theory. So, you see a stimulus, let us say you see a bear. So, that is the event, you encounter a situation. So, let us say you encounter something dangerous in the situation, then what will happen? So, there will be first this, and then there will be, the moment you see fear, there will be some bodily changes or physiological reactions of the body, okay? Like your heartbeat will increase, rapid breathing, trembling and so on, okay? And there may be some behavior like you will run away and so on. Then the brain will interpret this change as fear or emotions, feeling of emotions, okay? So, that is how the William James interpreted the mechanisms of emotions. So, more specifically, what this James Lange theory proposed, that the entire experience of emotion requires a sensation from the muscles of internal organs. So, emotion is directly connected to the sensations in the body through physiological changes. Emotion will fade once the sensation decreases. So, that is the idea. So, the emotion is directly linked to the physiological changes in the body or sensations in the body. Some well-known finding that drinking wine reduces anxiety was one such evidence they used to give for their theory. That when people, many times when they are very afraid or stressed, when they take wine, what does wine do? Wine, it relaxes the system, physiology of the body system, or too much of physiological arousal is reduced by the wine, and then people also accordingly their emotion also decreases, like stress and anxiety also decreases. So, wine lessens our body's reaction to stress, which causes you to feel less emotion as your body calms down. So, this is one of the evidence they used to give to support their theory. Okay? Now, however, there are certain limitations to this theory could not explain a lot of other things. Okay? So, some of these limitations are, so it was also criticized. One is, this theory was based on introspection and not based on experimental finding. This theory was primarily proposed based on introspection, like looking at your body, what it happens, not based on large scale experimental findings. Second, the researchers found that people with muscle paralysis and loss of sensation still might experience emotions. Since they linked bodily changes with the emotions directly, the research shows that lot of people, even when they had this complete muscle paralysis and loss of sensations from the body, they still experience emotions. So, that this cannot be explained by James Lange theory, because their theory proposes that emotion is based on the physiological sensation, but here the people who do not have sensations in the body, but still experiences emotions. American physiologist Walter Cannon, who proposed fight or flight response, also pointed very specific limitations. He said, individuals have very poor ability to perceive many subtle physiological changes induced by the sympathetic nervous system. How can the perception of physiological changes be the basis of emotional experience? What he says, as an individual, we are not able to detect all the minute physiological changes that happens in our body. We are not even aware of lot of changes that happens and lot of sensations that happens in the body. So, a lot of these subtle physiological changes happens induced by the sympathetic nervous system when we experience emotions. How can all the emotions be based on such physiological changes even when we are not even aware of a lot of these changes? How can the emotion be the basis? The physiological changes are the basis of emotions. Second argument, he said, the different emotions are associated with the same pattern of physiological arousal. How could different emotions be evoked by the same pattern of physiological arousal? He said a lot of emotions have similar physiological changes. So, how can the same physiological changes leads to diverse emotions if emotions are based on physiological changes? So, for every emotion then there has to be different physiological changes, which he said is not the case. So, these were his further arguments. He also said physiological changes depend on the secretions of hormones by the adrenal gland, because whenever we perceive emotion there are changes or secretions by the glands, our internal glands, but these secretions are very slow to be the basis of all emotions. How could the physiological changes that is not instantaneous be the basis of instantaneous emotional experience? Now, this lot of these hormonal changes happens slowly, but we experience lot of emotion instantly. So, how can the changes which are very slow be the basis for instant emotions? So, that also this theory cannot explain. Despite all this limitation, this was one of the first theory that prompted lot of interest in the conceptual understanding and theoretical understanding of emotions, and instigated some further research. Since Walter Cannon gave lot of criticized the James Lange theory, he himself with another person, Philip Bird, proposed an alternative theory which came to be known as Cannon-Bird theory. So, after rejecting James Lange theory, Walter Cannon, who discovered fight or flight response, and another leading physiologist Philip Bird proposed an alternative to the James Lange theory, which came to be known as Cannon-Bird theory. So, they based on their criticism, they propose alternative theory. This theory claims that an emotion is produced when an event or object is perceived by the thalamus. It is a small organ in the center of the brain. So, this is the thalamus, very small organ. So, emotion is produced when an event is perceived by this particular organ. So, there is an event happening in the outside, thalamus perceived it according to this model, which converts this information simultaneously to the cerebral cortex and the skeletal muscles and sympathetic nervous system. So, once the perception of an event happens by the thalamus, then simultaneously many things happens at the same time, not one after the other. At the same time, what happens? This information goes to cerebral cortex. So, cortex means this is where the outer layer of the brain where thinking happens, processing of information happens. Okay. So, one pathway goes to cortex and this information another simultaneously goes to the skeletal muscles. So, once you experience emotion, there is an information goes to the muscles. For example, if you experience fear, your body will try to run away or some kind of muscle movement will happen. So, muscle movement and sympathetic nervous system, okay, which gives you a lot of physiological changes. So, according to this model, this is not one after the other. In James Lange theory, physiological changes happens first, then emotion. So, there is a sequential link to that. Here it is saying once the perception happens, then simultaneously information goes to the cerebral cortex and then you interpret what is happening. Then also the information goes to the skeletal muscles and sympathetic nervous system where physiological changes may happen. So, this happens simultaneously, not one after the other. So, this is how the visual representation is here. So, you perceive a stimulus like a dog barking. So, this is a sensory input, sensory there is some kind of information you are getting from the environment. So, thalamus perceived, thalamus in the brain perceives there is a situation, then simultaneously one pathway will go to cerebral cortex, another pathway will go to this skeletal muscles and sympathetic nervous system and so on. Okay? So, physiological arousal here and here processing of information, then what is happening and so on. Simultaneously they both are happening simultaneously and that leads to simultaneous independent response. These are okay. This is what happens when we experience emotions. So, here they do not cause each other, they are simultaneously one path goes here, one path goes there. Okay. So, here if you see in the James Lange theory, physiological changes and emotional experience are independent process, both are triggered by thalamus simultaneously. Here it is independent process, but in James Lange theory they are like connected from one to other. So, then emotional response arises from this complex parallel processing and so on. So, cerebral cortex then uses the memories from the past experience to determine the nature of the event, okay, and gives you subjective experience of the emotion. If you see something is dangerous, then there is a fear experience and so on. Meanwhile, muscles and sympathetic nervous system, the another pathway that goes provide the physiological arousal that prepares the individual to take action like heartbeat will increase, breathing rate will become faster and so on. Cannon-Bird theory assumes that different emotions can be experienced with the same physiological arousal. So, therefore, he said we can experience diverse emotion from the same physiological arousal. For example, the same heartbeat increase and breathing increases and so on, the same physiological changes, but we can have multiple emotional experience because there is another path that goes to the cortex where you can interpret situation. and based on that you can say whether you are experiencing fear or anger and so on. Okay. So, same physiological arousal because it is happening simultaneously, but another pathway is going to cortex that can level it in the different emotional experiences. So, this theory, according to this theory, emotional cognitions and feelings are causally independent. So, they are not like directly one causing the other, independent of physiological arousal and behavior, even though these all aspects occur at the same time. More specifically, the cognitive appraisal, feeling and physiological behavior aspect of an emotions are independent. So, cognitive you perceive something, so that is the cognitive process. Then physiological changes happens like heartbeat increases and so on, and then you experience certain emotions. All three can be independent of each other and simultaneously happening. So, this is what this model says. So, for example, seeing a snake may instigate the feeling of fear. So, the moment you see a snake, it can instigate the feeling of fear, means emotion aspect of fear. Same time, you can have a physiological reaction such as rapid heartbeat increasing at the same time. Both can happen simultaneously. According to this theory, both the feelings and physiological reactions are simultaneous and independent. So, this is how it is different from the James Lange theory. So, Cannon-Burt theory is also called thalamic theory of emotions. It states that thalamus in the brain controls emotional experience here, and cortex of the brain controls emotional expression and so on. So, these feelings and physical reaction occur simultaneously. So, this theory. However, later research did not support the role of thalamus as it is proposed in this theory in the emotions. Some of the research on victims of spinal cord injury has provided some support to the Cannon-Burt theory, that even though they because of the spinal cord injury they were not getting physiological response from the body or sensations from the body, still they could experience emotions, as we said, because it can happen independently. So, some studies found that people with spinal cord injuries that prevented them from perceiving their bodily arousal experience, they can experience distinct emotions. This violates James Lange theory, but supports Cannon-Burt theory with the assumption that emotional experience depends on the brain perceptions of the ongoing event, because perception of the event can also determine what emotions, even though there is no physiological input from the body. So, both of these theories have influenced research. Obviously, both are not perfect theories, they both have limitations. Both theories are limited and criticized for their overgeneralization of emotions and contradiction between theory and lot of evidences. Cannon-Burt theory actually stimulated a lot of interest in the cognitive aspect of emotions, like how brain perceives. So, that part was very important in the theory, that stimulated further research into cognitive theories. So, some of these cognitive theories we will also talk. One such theory where cognitive aspects plays very important role is Schechter-Singer theory, which is also called as two-factor theory. So, let us look into what are the propositions. The two-factor theory of emotion put forth in 1960s by Stanley Schechter and Jerome Singer is one of the earlier cognitive theories of emotions, where they gave a lot of importance to the interpretation of the situation in the process of emotions. So, according to this theory, there are two key components of emotions. One is physiological arousal and cognitive leveling. So, there are two important things happens in every emotions. One is there will be bodily changes, physiological arousals like heartbeat increases and so on, and there is a cognitive level part to it. Cognitive level means how do you interpret these situations and so on. These two are very important in every emotions. Now, this physiological arousal includes those activation of sympathetic nervous system like increasing heartbeat, sweating, trembling and so on. All these are called comes under physiological arousal. Cognitive processing or labeling includes interpreting this physiological arousal by looking at the surrounding and finding the causes. So, here she says whenever this physiological changes happens then the mind tries to interpret it by looking at the situations, and then it labels certain emotions based on what is the situation. So, cognitive part plays very important role. For example, if your heart is beating faster, you may label different emotion based on the situation in which one is placed. So, based on the situation, the same physiological arousal can be interpreted or labeled with the different emotions. For example, you may interpret your racing heart as happiness if you are in a party, and may interpret as an anger if insulted by someone. Okay. So, same heartbeat, different situation, different emotions are interpreted. So, this is what So, interpretation of the situation plays very important role in this theory. So, this theory says that physiological arousal is also very important and cognitive interpretation is also important. Therefore, it is called two-factor theory. So, what is the role of physiological arousal here? It is often accompanies most of the emotions and it determines the intensity of emotional experience. So, there is no direct contribution of physiological arousal in terms of emotions, but what physiological arousal does that if the intensity of physiological arousal is higher, you interpret the higher intensity of emotions. So, intensity is determined by the physiological arousal, but actually what kind of emotion you are experiencing is through the cognitive interpretation. That leveling is given by the cognitive process. How do you interpret the situation? That determines what kind of emotion you are experiencing. Physiological arousal only decides the intensity. If your heartbeat is very fast, you will experience the emotion as very strong. And what emotion you will experience depends on the interpretation of the situation. So, if your heartbeat is very fast, in case of happy situation, your happiness will be very strong or high intensity, and accordingly in case of other emotions. So, this theory assumes all emotions evoke similar physiological response, that one cannot recognize which emotion is feeling just by observing body's reactions, which was the problem with the James Lange theory. All emotion almost evoke similar physiological response. So, just based on physiological reference, it is difficult to say which emotion you cannot interpret. So, we identify emotion on the basis of all the information you have about the situation. Physiological arousal only adds intensity to it, but it is the interpretation of the situation that determines that leveling of emotions. Therefore, the difference between two emotions lies in the cognitive appraisal aspect, not the feeling of physiology. So, the focus is more on the cognitive appraisal. How do you interpret the situation? Therefore, this theory typically comes under cognitive theories of emotions. So, this is just the visual representation of it. So, you are walking and then so there can be two factors. One is physiological arousal will happen the moment you see a situation which can have a potential emotional reaction. You encounter a potentially dangerous situation. So, that is the situation here. So, the moment you encounter a dangerous situation, one aspect will be there will be physiological arousal in the body, like heartbeat will increase and so on. Another aspect will be the cognitive leveling. What is in the situation? How do you interpret the situation? So, you see the moment you are on a dark night, or let us say you are walking and then you think there is a bear. The moment you see the situation, you see bear, there is a danger in my life, it can attack me. So, you are interpreting all this situation. So, this is cognitive appraisals and interpretation. So, that means this is a dangerous situation. So, emotion is leveled by this interpretation of danger in the situation. So, you experience fear here. Fear is determined by this cognitive leveling. Physiological arousal will only determine the intensity of the fear, how much fear you are experiencing. If the physiological arousal is very high, your fear experiences also will be very high. So, just to give brief comparison of these three theories, because a lot of concepts one may get confused, but the thing is both theories, the concept and in the interpretation or explanation of emotions or mechanisms of emotions are little different from each other. So, if you see James Lange theory, physiological arousal and behavior determines emotions, like in a sequential sense. Whenever you come to a situation, physiological arousal happens, and then based on the physiological changes you experience emotions. So, emotion is determined by the physiological changes. Cannon-Barth theory says physiological arousal, behavior and emotions are all independent. They all happen together at the same time, not one after the other and one determining other. So, all are independently experienced. Schechter-Singer theory says physiological changes determine only the strength or intensity of the emotion, but appraisal and interpretation of the events determine the specific emotions and behavior. As we gave example. So, based on the situation or interpretation of the situation, you see whether you are experiencing fear or whether experiencing happiness and so on. Physiological arousal does not actually determine the specific emotions. Now, in the cognitive theories, there are some other theories which also can be collectively called as appraisal theories of emotions, they also come under cognitive theories. So, little bit of conceptual, little bit of difference here and there. So, appraisal theories of emotion says that emotions are derived from primarily from the appraisal, assessment or interpretation or explanation of the situations. Okay? The focus is only on the interpretation of the situation. So, these are called appraisal theories of emotion. It was primarily established by a work of eminent researcher, specifically Magda Arnold and Lazarus. They contributed a lot in the appraisal theories of emotion. So, appraisal theories of emotion explain that emotions are not automatic reactions, but arises from how we interpret. If you see a lot of other theories, it almost looks like emotion situation come and automatically emotion happens. Appraisal theory says no, it is result of your appraisal, how do you interpret consciously, and then the emotion is determined. It is not always automatically happen and so on. Your conscious interpretation of the situation plays very important role. For example, imagine you see a dog running towards you. Okay? Now, what emotion you experience completely depends on how you are interpreting. If you think it will bite me, you will experience fear. If you think it's friendly, you will experience happiness. Same situation, different interpretation, different emotions. So, the emotion was primarily determined by your interpretation. Okay. So, that is the typical idea of appraisal theories. So, this term appraisal was coined by Magda Arnold and to describe this cognitive process that came before arousal of emotions. So, cognitive emotion as appraisal is the first step. That is the main factor in the emotional experience. Physiological arousal may happen later. In 1960s, she created her cognitive theory, which stated that appraisal of the situation is the first stage. So, that is the first thing. How do you interpret? Everything comes later. Arnold claims that initial appraisal triggers both physiological response and emotional experiences itself. So, the main causal factor of emotion is appraisal or interpretation of the situation. Then it may trigger physiological changes in the body and all the other things associated with the emotions. But the first step is appraisal of the situation, interpretation of the situation. So, she recognized physiological changes in this way are crucial because they are also associated with emotion, but not the cause of people's reactions as experiences. So, but they are not the cause. Cause is the appraisal, but their physiological changes are associated with the emotions, but they are not the causal factors. Then Lazarus also kind of little bit elaborated the same Arnold's theory, which is also called as cognitive mediational theory. He just elaborated a little bit more on this theory. So, Arnold's work was slightly modified and adapted by Richard Lazarus as he developed his cognitive mediational theory, which claimed that our appraisals of stimuli determine emotion just like Arnold. So, here focus is again given just similar to the earlier appraisal theory of Arnold, that our appraisal of stimuli determines emotion. So, that is the main primary factors. He argued that appraisal precedes both physiological arousal and the emotional experiences. First interpretation happens, then physiological arousal, emotional experiences, all these things happens, just like the earlier theory. So, the process is first you see a stimulus, then you appraise it, interpret what is this stimulus, is it dangerous, is there any threat to my life, whatever it is, you appraise all this. Then emotional response plus physiological arousal may happen simultaneously. So, for example, if you see a snake, you appraise it as a dangerous. Why you are afraid of snake? Because you interpret this is dangerous. So, without interpretation, there will not be any emotion. You feel fear. If you are a herpetologist like who studies snake and deals with snake on a daily basis, they may appraise it as a rare find and feel excited when they see a new snake, because the interpretation is different. You are afraid of a snake, another person is happy to see a snake, depending on their interpretations. So, that is the idea of cognitive theory. So, Lazarus maintains that appraisals comes before cognitive leveling. So, leveling, so first you interpret, so that is the first thing, even if it comes before cognitive leveling. Generating both physiological arousal and emotional experiences are determined by the appraisal process itself. So, if you remember Schechter-Singer theory, two-factor theory, how it is different from this theory? According to Schechter-Singer theory, we experience physiological arousal first and then look at our environment to cognitive level. So, that theory says the first physiological, because you come to a situation, then physiological arousal happen, then you interpret the physiological arousal by looking at the situation, interpreting. So, interpretation comes later in the Schechter-Singer theory. This theory says no, even cognitive leveling, everything comes later. The first comes the appraisal interpretation, then all the other things comes. So, according to Lazarus, the cognitive activity involved in interpreting emotional context can be conscious or unconscious. Sometimes this interpretation is very consciously you do it, sometimes it is very unconscious, automatically it happens and triggers. And in a lot of these cases, it may not take a shape of conceptual processing or detailed processing. He emphasized that cognitive processes govern the quality and intensity of emotions by mediating the link between the persons and the environment through coping methods which turn from the basis of emotional reactions. Lazarus model also talks about how do we appraise or interpret situations, particularly in the stressful context, stress and so on. So, Lazarus says there are two types of appraisal methods in the context of particularly stressful situation and so on. He said one is called primary appraisal, means it aims to identify importance of the meaning of an event. Primary appraisal means you see a situation or you see something and then you see whether it is dangerous, whether it is harmless, harmful. Overall, you see the nature of the stimulus. So, that is called primary appraisal. Then comes secondary appraisal, which is about analyzing the individual's ability to cope with the events. So, once you see whether it is dangerous or it is harmless, whatever it is, that is primary. Secondary appraisal, you see if based on the situation, will I be able to deal with the situation, because whenever there is a stressful situation, there is some kind of dealing needs to be done. Secondary appraisal happens and it is about analysis of your ability to cope with the event. You try to interpret, will I be able to deal with the situation? If yes, then there will be some kind of experience. If you say I cannot handle the situation, you will have different experiences. So, that is called secondary appraisal. So, primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, mostly in the context of stressful situations. So, these are some of the things he elaborated on the Arnold's theory. So, Lazarus he defined this primary appraisal in the context of emotion and stress as judgment of the degree of possible harm, threat, whatever the situation, that is called primary. Sense of threat then prompts secondary appraisal, a judgment of what are the options available, will I be able to handle and so on. For example, when someone is facing interview situation, the first whether you will feel stressed in the interview depends on primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. In primary appraisal, you will see whether this interview is a dangerous situation for you. Is it like important or very challenging? How do you overall look at the situation of the interview? So, that will determine. Then also you will also try to interpret what abilities you have. Do you have enough abilities to deal with the interview situation? Do you have communication skill? Do you have knowledge about the subject and so on? So, if you have knowledge and understanding, then secondary appraisal or coping is much stronger, then you will experience much less stress. So, depending on these two appraisal processes, your outcome of emotions and stress will depend on these two factors. Another theory that also little bit add nuances to all this understanding is called Zezong-Lidoc's theory of emotion. So, this theory explains that some emotion can occur without conscious thinking. He said, like cognitive theories generally talks about interpretation of the situation, mostly conscious interpretation. This theory says not necessarily all emotions are conscious interpretation based. This theory challenges some of these appraisal theories that we discussed, that we don't always need to think to feel an emotion. We don't always think and then feel emotion. So, that was like a major idea in the cognitive theory. In many situations, our brain can take a low route, fast pathway to produce emotions. Sometimes very fast, instantaneous emotion can be there without even thinking. For example, fear comes before cognitive rationalization. Many times when we experience fear, we don't even think and then feel fear. The moment situation comes, danger situation comes, we experience fear. It's almost instantly. So, this is called low route according to this model, very fast pathway, whereas emotions such as love comes after a lot of cognitive rationalization, and you may consciously think about situation and so on. It may not be instantaneous, and it may take time and conscious processing and so on. So, depending on the different kinds of emotions, some emotion could be very instantaneous without even thinking, some can require a lot of thinking process. So, this theory distinguishes these two aspects or two pathways. So, this is often explained by Leadox identified two distinct pathways of emotion, like one is called low route, fast and unconscious. So, here from thalamus to amygdala, very quick, automatic, no thinking. For example, you jump back immediately when you see a snake like object, immediately you jump back, you do not even think. So, that is called low route of emotions. Okay? Even before realizing it is a rope, it may be in the dark, there is a rope, but the moment you see, you think it is a snake and you immediately jump back, you do not even think. So, that is called low road, fast and unconscious processing. Then there is a high road, slow and conscious processing that may lead to emotions. So, the pathway goes from this emotional centers to the cortex, where you consciously process it and then emotion happens. It is slow or involves thinking and evaluation. So, let us say there is some snake like object, but you consciously carefully look at it and realize that it is a rope. So, there is a conscious intervention, you do not automatically not jumping. So, sometimes that kind of also emotion we experience. So, you feel calm and so on. So, like this, so you have discussed different kinds of theories of emotions, and a lot of these theories have different explanations for how emotions are experiences. So, how do you conclude and get what is the point of all these theories? So, all these theories indicate certain truth about emotions. So, emotions are not like one unitary thing. So, there can be different mechanisms for different kinds of emotions depending on the context and so on, and all these theories add different dimensions to look at emotions. They are true in certain context, may not explain all the situations, all the emotions, but they explain certain context emotions in certain context, and certain types of emotions. So, all theories indicate certain truths about emotion, such as physiological, evolutionary, cognitive reasons for emotions. Every theory has limitations and no theory is perfect. Understanding of all these theories needed for holistic insights about emotions. Okay? So, all these theories will adds to our understanding of emotions, from different angles, but no theory is perfect, because every theory cannot explain all the situations. So, all this have understood the role of physiology in emotions, role of cognitive processing in emotions, rules of evolutionary explanations. All these explanations are valid, but they are all not complete in itself. So, there are multidimensional explanation needed for understanding emotions, and this theory served some of this understanding from the different perspectives. Now, let us look at one of the practical applications of all this understanding. So, we have seen positive emotion, for example. So, when we look at emotions, one can be positive category of emotion and one can be negative emotions. So, a lot of these theories we discussed about the different types of emotions. So, that those theories were very general, but if you look at in general, some emotions can be negative, like they are unpleasant, like anger, fear and so on, and some emotions are positive in a sense, like they are pleasant, like if you feel joyful, if you feel gratitude and so on, if you feel love as an emotion, these are all positive emotions, and research shows that obviously negative emotions has their importance, positive emotions have their importance, but when we experience too much of negative emotions, they can lead to many harmful impacts, particularly in the body, and cause a lot of diseases and so on. Okay? So, I will not go into too much of that, just to look at applications that if you experience more positive emotions in our life, it is going to be more beneficial for our physical and mental health. So, one of the theory that talks about the benefits of positive emotion is proposed by Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. So, I will not go too much detail of the theory, just to give you gist of it, just to give an idea of applications of it, that positive emotions like joy, love, interest, all these positive emotions, they broaden attention and thinking. So, these positive emotions, what they do? broaden your attention on things. The moment you experience joy, you become expanded. You want to go out and share, and you feel happy and so on. So your whole perspective becomes broader, your thinking becomes broader. When you experience negative emotion like fear or sadness, you shrink. You don't want to go out, you want to remain on your own. So you kind of, your thinking process, attention becomes shrink. And so that is one difference between positive and negative emotions. So positive emotion broadens your attention and thinking, which is good for your functioning level. It also builds long-term resources like skills, relationship and knowledge. So if you have more positive emotions, you are more likely to learn more. If you enjoy doing something, if you are happy in doing something, you will learn it faster. Positive emotions also build relationship. It also increases knowledge. So a lot of skills, a lot of resources are built by positive emotions much more faster. Positive emotions help reverse body stress response, because stress response are because of the negative emotions. You feel a lot of stress means a lot of negative emotions. So it like have a negative impact from the physiology point of view, and it can cause many diseases like heart diseases and so on. So a lot of this negative impact could be reversed by positive emotions, like it will negate the negative impact. So in that connection, it can improve physical health, like improve immunity. It enhances resilience. Positive emotions, if you experience, you are more likely to bounce back quickly after some adversity or negative event. So because that will kind of negate the negative impact of negative emotions. It strengthens relationship and so on. So these are some of the findings which talks that positive emotion has a lot of benefits if we experience it sufficiently in our life. That doesn't mean the negative emotions are bad. They also have survival advantage. But what happens, most of the people experience too many negative emotions, which is causing a lot of problems in context of mental and physical health. So if you experience more positive emotions as compared to negative emotions, then obviously we are in a more balanced pathway to increase well-being and so on. So in terms of applications of all this understanding, what we need to do, we need to increase more positive emotions in our life. How can we do that? Just these are some of the ideas. Okay? One is by practicing gratitude. So gratitude means what? You look at life in terms of focusing on what you have, not what you don't have. So gratitude means you become thankful for what you have in your life, what people have given to you. So you say thankful towards that. Because human nature is like that, we focus more on complaining, focus more on what I don't have, and it creates negative emotions. You feel unfulfilled, you feel more anger, more resentment because something is not there, which is naturally the human mind tendencies are like this. So gratitude is like you consciously shift your attention and see also I have many things also, and you become thankful for it, for whatever skills you have, whatever knowledge you have, whatever relationship you have, what are the caring people that you have, whatever achievement you have. So a lot of things we can focus on in terms of whatever life context we have, and we can be grateful about. The moment you become grateful, it increases positive emotions immediately. The moment you start complaining something, obviously it will instigate negative emotions. Okay? So positive emotions, one way to increase is, very effective technique is to become more, exercise more gratitude towards things that you have. Consciously you can do it in your life also. Then it can also increase by doing activities that you enjoy. Positive emotion is always increased by when you do something that you enjoy doing, like whatever hobbies you have. Try to do them more and more things which you enjoy. So positive emotions will increase. Spending time with loved ones, this is obviously the best one in terms of human society. When we are with our loved ones, we experience positive emotions, probably the greatest source of positive emotions. So spend more time with them, and then playing with children, pets and friends, these are also very important source of positive emotions, because these are the people, these are the things that they don't judge you too much, and you feel comfortable, happy in their presence. Children, pets, good friends. Research also shows doing exercises, particularly aerobic exercises, also increase positive emotions. So if you do regular exercises, like not typical gym oriented exercise, but like running, cycling, swimming, this kind of aerobic exercises, they change your brain chemistry in terms of releases hormones like endorphins, and they enhance your mood and make them more positive. You feel good about yourself. So regular exercise also helps you to increase positive emotions. Then obviously listening uplifting music that you like can also increase positive emotions. So these are some of the ideas by which we can, like this, just to give you some practical applications of understanding of emotions. So we can increase the frequency of positive emotions in our life. That will do a lot of wonders in terms of your mental and physical health. So with this I stop here. Thank you.